Shalom and welcome to Nether Glide Jewish Ministries, where we teach the Bible from a Jewish, historical, cultural, and linguistic perspective. We're continuing in our series in the book of Genesis, and this is teaching number 7. We'll be focusing on Genesis chapter 4, and I've titled this teaching with a question: what does God expect from humanity? Now, in the previous teaching, we finished Genesis chapter 3, and Genesis chapter 3 ends with Adam and Eve being expelled from the garden, right? We read this last verse in Genesis 3. Then the man was cast out, and he, meaning God, placed cherubim east of the Garden of Eden and a flaming sword that destroys to guard the way to the tree of life. That's Genesis 3:24. Now, Genesis chapter 3 records how both Adam and Eve were cast out of the Garden of Eden because of their disobedience to the Word of God. Now, a natural question that we think about is, how much time did Adam and Eve spend in the Garden of Eden? And we just don't have an answer to that. We don't know if it was days, weeks, months, or even years. Now, as we go into Genesis chapter 4, we get a glimpse into the generations of Adam and Eve as they began to fulfill their God-given mandate of being fruitful, multiplying, and filling the earth. Genesis chapter 4 focuses on two main people, and that is the sons of Adam and Eve. Their names are Cain and Abel. Now, I want to begin with a few questions before we get into the text of Genesis chapter 4. Number one, what did God expect from humanity in the beginning, meaning up to and including Genesis chapter 4? Number two, why did Cain kill his brother Abel? Number three, in what ways did Cain sin against God? And number four, what does God expect from humanity today? So hopefully we'll find clear answers to these questions as we go through this teaching. Let's begin with Genesis chapter 4, verses 1 to 5. Then Adam had relations with Chava, his wife, and she became pregnant and gave birth to Cain. And she said, I have obtained a man from the Lord. And she gave birth again to his brother Abel. Now Abel was a shepherd of flocks, and Cain was a worker of the soil. And it happened at the end of days that Cain brought an offering to the Lord from the fruit of the ground. And Abel also brought from the firstlings of his flocks and from the fat portions. And the Lord looked favorably upon Abel and his offering, but upon Cain and his offering he did not look favorably. And it angered Cain greatly, and his face was downcast. Now, as we begin Genesis chapter 4, I want us to think about the Hebrew names of Cain and Abel and what they mean. We read in these verses that Chava, which is the Hebrew name for Eve, and remember that name means, it comes from Chai, life, and she is the mother of the living, right? And Eve gave the name Cain to her firstborn son because she said, Kaniti ish et Adonai, which we translate as, I have obtained a man from the Lord. Now, the word obtained in Hebrew is kana, and it means to obtain, to acquire, to buy. So the name Cain is a form of the word kana, right? To obtain. So we see how that works out in this naming of Cain. Now, the name Abel in Hebrew is hevel, which means breath, vapor, or vanity. And we can see how those meanings all kind of form one, right? A breath is something that's there and disappears, and that's why it has the meaning of vanity as well. Now we see how hevel is used in the book of Job, in Job 7:16, where Job says, I waste away, I will not live forever, leave me alone, for my days are only a breath, right? The word hevel there. And more than likely, the name Hevel for Abel carries with it the idea of breath as life, right? So Abel was named Hevel, breath, and he was a living one at that time. It's interesting because we also see it used as something that is that passes quickly, and Hevel's life was taken early, we know as well, Abel's life, right? So anyway, we'll continue in the story and see how that plays out. Now, what were the occupations of Cain and Abel? Very clearly explained to us. Cain was a farmer. He worked the soil to produce food, and Abel was a shepherd of flocks. And we read in verses 3 and 4, and it happened at the end of days that Cain brought an offering to the Lord from the fruit of the ground, and Abel also brought from the firstlings of his flocks and from the fat portions. Now, why did Cain and Abel bring their offerings to the Lord? Was this a known expectation at that time? What was the occasion at the end of days, as we read about it in the text here. So it's interesting to see how these phrases are used, but they're not really fully explained. Now, just to understand the Hebrew here, the phrase, and it happened at the end of days in Hebrew is Vayehi Miketz Yamim. And this phrase Miketz Yamim is something actually we see generally in the scriptures. And it's also used as an act, or it's tied together with an act of God. We see examples of this in a few different scriptures, and I want to point them out here. So number one, we see an example from the life of Elijah during the time of drought, and this was a well-known story in the Bible, as we read it in 1 Kings 17:7-8, where we read, "But it happened after a while that the brook dried up because there was no rain in the land. Then the word of the Lord came to him saying," right? And so just to understand the use of Miketz Yamim here, right? After these certain period of days finish, we see how not only the brook dried up, but the Lord spoke to Elijah. And then in Jeremiah 13:6, we read this: "After many days, the Lord said to me, Arise, go to the Euphrates, and take from there the undergarment which I commanded you to hide there." So again, we see how after a certain period of days, the Lord speaks to Jeremiah. Now, in all three of these instances, both in Genesis, 1 Kings, and in Jeremiah, the exact same Hebrew phrase is used, V'hiyi miketz yamim. And it's most naturally translated as, "and it happened at the end of days." Now, this phrase is then consistently followed by an encounter with God doing something or saying something. At the end of a certain period of time, there is God's appointed time where God says or does something. Now, although the text in Genesis 4 does not explicitly state what was happening at the quote-unquote end of days, we can assume from the context that it was connected to the time of harvest or the time of first fruits of the harvest. There was an expectation of bringing first fruits as an offering to the Lord. And we see this most clearly in Abel's offering. In verse 4, we read that Abel brought mi bechirot tsono, from the firstlings of his flocks, u me chelvehen, and from the fat portions. So this offering of Abel is in agreement with the biblical principle that the first fruits and the firstborn belong to the Lord, particularly regarding the offering from the flocks. Now, Abel brought the firstlings of his flocks as an offering to the Lord. This is in keeping with the law, which is later given to the Israelites, as we read in Exodus chapter 22, verses 29-30. "You shall not hold back the offering from your entire harvest and your wine. The firstborn of your sons you shall give to me. You shall do the same with your oxen and with your sheep. It shall be with its mother for 7 days. On the 8th day you shall give it to me." That's Exodus 22, 29-30. So Abel also brought the fat portions to the Lord, which is in accordance to what we read in the book of Leviticus. "The priest shall offer them up in smoke on the altar as food, an offering by fire as a soothing aroma. All fat is the Lord's. It is a permanent statute throughout your generations. In all your dwelling places you shall not eat any fat or any blood." That's Leviticus 3:16-17. And we're reminded that all the blood and fat of the offerings belong to the Lord. Now, according to the law, we read in Deuteronomy how the Lord required a tenth or a tithe of all the produce of the land and of the flocks and herds. Deuteronomy 14:22-23 reads, "You shall certainly tithe all the produce from what you sow, which comes from the field every year. You shall eat it in the presence of the Lord your God at the place where he chooses to establish his name. The tithe of your grain, your new wine, your oil, and the firstborn of your herd and your flock, so that you may learn to fear the Lord your God always." The tithe of the field and the flocks belong to the Lord, right? It all belongs to God, and giving back a tenth to him is part of what he expects. The purpose of the tithe, as stated in Deuteronomy 14, was in order to, quote, "learn to fear the Lord your God always." It is a principle of honoring God and remembering that everything we have comes from him. Now, what was the expectation for the first family, Adam and Eve and their children, on earth regarding the tithe? Although we do not read specifically that God commanded the tithe of the produce of the field and flocks, there was obviously a clear expectation of first fruits as an offering to the Lord. Abel understood this principle of the first fruits and acted accordingly. Cain either did not understand the first fruits principle or he chose not to do it. And it seems like the latter is actually what was true. Abel brought the firstlings of the flock together with the fat portions as an offering to the Lord. Cain brought fruit from the ground as an offering to the Lord. In verse 3, the Hebrew reads, Vayavi Cain mipri ha'adamah mincha la'Adonai, that Cain brought an offering to the Lord from the fruit of the ground. Cain's offering is not called first fruits, but simply fruit of the ground. Cain's offering was probably some vegetables, right? That which grows from the ground, or some kind of what would you say, something green or whatever grows from the ground. Now the Lord looked favorably upon Abel's offering of the firstlings, but he did not look favorably upon Cain's offering of vegetables, whatever he had brought to the Lord. Now Cain responded to the Lord's unfavorable looking upon his offering with anger. Why was Cain angry? What caused Cain to become angry? These are good questions. In fact, they're so good that the Lord himself asked these questions of Cain. As we continue in Genesis 4, verses 6 to 9, then the Lord said to Cain, "Why are you angry? And why has your countenance fallen? Is it not so? If you do well, it will be accepted. But if you do not do well, sin is resting at the door, and its desire is for you, but you must rule over it." Then Cain spoke to his brother Abel, and then it happened that while they were in the field, that Cain rose up against Abel his brother and killed him. Then the Lord said to Cain, "Where is your brother Abel?" And he said, "I don't know. Am I the keeper of my brother?" Now, after the Lord initially questioned Cain, he told him that he has two options. Number one, if you do well, it will be accepted. Number two, but if you do not do well, sin is resting at the door and its desire is for you, but you must rule over it. Cain was presented with a clear and simple choice: to choose to do which is right or to sin. God told Cain that if he did well, his offering would be accepted. However, if he did not do well, he would be led into sin. The Lord commanded Cain to conquer his sin and do what was right. Now, what did it mean for Cain to do what was right? In Hebrews 11 of the New Testament, we read about the offerings of Cain and Abel. Hebrews 11, verse 4. By faith, Abel offered to God a better sacrifice than Cain, through which he obtained the testimony that he was righteous, God testifying about his gifts, and through faith, though he is dead, he still speaks. Hebrews 11:4. Now Abel did what was right in God's eyes and offered a sacrifice that was accepted, but Cain did not. It seems that Cain simply needed to bring a first fruits offering to the Lord. Now, I want to share my opinion about something that could also be a possible expectation from the Lord at that time. Now, it may have been that God expected or demanded an animal sacrifice from Cain as well. This is not 100% clear from the text, so I'm just guessing or surmising, but it's possible. Now, if Cain needed to bring an animal sacrifice, then Cain would have needed to purchase an animal from his younger brother Abel. It is possible that Cain did not want to humble himself and go to his brother Abel, or that he was simply jealous that Abel's offering was accepted while his own offering was not accepted. So it was a bit of jealousy or just unhappiness that his offering wasn't accepted, right? Now, Cain was also the elder brother, the firstborn. And we see many examples in the scriptures of firstborns who feel entitled and find it difficult to humble themselves. And we have examples of Reuben and Miriam, Moses' sister, and Eliab, King David's eldest brother. And there are many others. Now, although we do not know the exact specifics of what the Lord required from Cain at that time, it was certainly related to this offering of the first fruits. The next part of the story is lacking in detail. Right after the Lord finished speaking to Cain in verse 7, we read the beginning of verse 8, which says, quote, "Then Cain spoke to his brother Abel," unquote. Now, what did Cain speak to his brother Abel? What was the conversation about? We are not told what Cain said or what their conversation was about. However, actions speak louder than words, as the text reveals. And then we read, and then it happened that while they were in the field, that Cain rose up against Abel, his brother, and killed him. Cain ignored the warning of the Lord and gave in to sin rather than ruling over it and doing what was good and right in God's eyes. Cain killed his brother Abel. Now, in another New Testament reference to Cain, we read this in 1 John chapter 3, verses 11 to 12. For this is the message which you have heard from the beginning, that we should love one another, not as Cain, who was of the evil one and slew his brother. And for what reason did he slay him? Because his deeds were evil and his brothers were righteous. So here we read about the deeds of Cain and Abel, right? Cain did what was evil, but Abel did what was right, and accepted in God's eyes. The Lord then confronted Cain in verse 9, where we read, Then the Lord said to Cain, Where is your brother Abel? And he said, I don't know. Am I the keeper of my brother? This is actually a very powerful statement, this verse. It speaks volumes because Cain was speaking from his heart. Now, in what ways did Cain sin against God? I asked this question at the beginning, and I think it's important because we generally just think of Cain as sinning against God by committing murder, right? By killing his brother. But I think there's much more that we see in the text here. Number one, Cain did not offer the right sacrifice to the Lord, whether it was from the first fruits from the soil and or an animal sacrifice. Whatever God expected, Cain knew what it was. He did not do it. Number two, he killed his brother, right? He committed murder. That's the obvious one. But number three, he lied to God. He said he doesn't know where his brother is. And number four, he mocked his brother's occupation as a shepherd or a keeper of the flocks. And I want to explain this a little bit more because we see a clear understanding of this in the Hebrew. Cain's answer to the Lord was not only a lie, but he seems to make an effort to belittle or mock his brother soon after murdering him. Cain's response to the Lord in Hebrew was, Lo yadati hashomer achi anuchi? I don't know. Am I the keeper of my brother? Now, the Hebrew word shomer means to keep or guard and is often used for a shepherd, one who keeps guard over his flocks. It appears from the text that Cain was mocking Abel's occupation as a keeper of the sheep when Cain stated he is not the quote-unquote keeper of his brother. The Lord then judged Cain in the next verses as we read in Genesis 4:10 to 16. And he said, What have you done? The voice of the blood of your brother cries out to me from the soil. And now cursed are you from the soil, which opened its mouth to take in the blood of your brother from your hand. When you work the soil, it will no more give its strength to you. You will wander and move about on the earth. And Cain said to the Lord, My iniquity is too great to bear. Behold, today you have driven me away from the face of the earth, and from your presence I am hidden away, and I will wander about on the earth. And it will happen that whoever finds me will kill me. And the Lord said to him, Therefore anyone who kills Cain, vengeance will come upon him 7 times. And the Lord placed a sign upon Cain that whoever finds him will not strike him. And Cain went out from the presence of the Lord, and he settled in the land of Nod, east of Eden. So the Lord exposed the lie of Cain as the Lord stated to Cain, quote, The voice of the blood of your brother cries out to me from the soil. Such a powerful statement. The soil is uniquely personified as the Lord stated that the soil opened its mouth to take in the blood of Abel. Cain tried to hide his sin of murdering his brother by burying him in the soil. The Lord judged Cain by saying, quote, Cursed are you from the soil. Cain would no longer enjoy the fruit of the soil. And this is very, I think, fitting or ironic in a sense. The curse of Cain from the soil seems fitting since it appeared that Cain did not bring the first fruits from the soil to the Lord. Cain also complained to the Lord that his punishment was too great and that he was afraid that someone else would kill him. And I just want to share something that I think is true that we see in life, and that is that most people fear the very evil that they do to others, just as Cain did, right? Cain murdered, and he feared that others would murder him. And I think this is something true. This is why we are to do good to others, right? So that we will expect others to do good to us. God placed a sign on Cain to prevent others from killing him. Now, the Hebrew word for sign is ot. And what was the the sign that God placed on Cain to keep others from killing him. Silence is the best answer here because we're not given any clarity regarding what that sign was. Now we know that the Lord also punished Cain, saying, quote, "You will wander and move about on the earth," in verse 12. And in Hebrew, this reads, "Na venad tihye ba'aretz." Now the Hebrew word nad here comes from the root nud, meaning to wander or to move about. Now it's fitting later in verse 16 as we read the name of the place where Cain settled, and we read it Be'eretz Nod, in the land of wandering. So we see this unique connection again, right, to the meaning of the words here. So Cain was a wanderer, right, and he dwelt in this land of wandering. Now we then read about the descendants of Cain in his land of wandering in the next set of verses. So let's continue in verses 17 to 22. "And Cain had relations with his wife, and she became pregnant and gave birth to Hanok. And he built a city and called the name of the city like the name of his son, Hanok. And to Hanok was born Irad, and Irad begot Mehujael, and Mehujael begot Metushael, and Metushael begot Lemech. Now Lamech took to himself two wives. The name of the one was Adah, and the name of the second was Tzilah. And Adah gave birth to Yovel. He was the father of those who dwell in tents and have livestock. And the name of his brother was Yuval. He was the father of all those who mastered the harp and the pipe. And Tzilah also gave birth to Tuval Cain, an instructor for all fabricating of bronze and iron. And the sister of Tuval Cain was Naamah. Now, in this verses, we read about the descendants of Cain. Now, in order to have descendants, a man needs a wife or a woman, right? So where did Cain get his wife? Who was Cain's wife? Did Adam and Eve only have two children up to this point in the biblical account? That's all we read about so far. Now, most definitely, they had other children as well. And how do we know this? Because as we look ahead into Genesis 5, the next chapter, verse 4, it says, "Then the days of Adam, after he fathered Seth, were 800 years, and he fathered other sons and daughters." So they had other children, right? We're only given specific names of a few. We also read in the text how Cain journeyed east and had children with his wife. So Cain's wife was one of his sisters, right? One of Adam and Eve's daughters. And we have to remember that life was a bit different in the beginning. Brothers and sisters married each other. Now we even read about this later, centuries later, in the life of Abraham. Abraham married his half-sister Sarah, who was the daughter of his father, but not his mother, right? You can read that in Genesis 20, verse 12. And then 500 years after the life of Abraham, we read how the Lord specified more clearly that it was not permitted to marry a close relative, right? As we read about it in the Torah, in the law. And I have several scriptures listed there: Leviticus 18, Leviticus 20, and Deuteronomy 27. And we have to remember how that creation process, the generation process was slowly moved apart from the original family and into not marrying those in your immediate family. Now, possible reasons for why a complete list of the descendants of Adam and Eve is not given is as follows. Number one, the Word of God is written in such a manner that it generally focuses on specific people in order to tell the story that God wants us to know without all the details, right? So in Genesis 4, we read specifically of Cain and Abel as the children of Adam and Eve, and we read the story about them, right? And especially regarding the first fruits as well as Cain killing Abel. Number two, the number of children from Adam and Eve was too great to list. They probably had dozens upon dozens, even hundreds of children. Adam and Eve were the first couple, and they had many children. There is no record of how many children they had. However, Adam lived to be 930 years old, and there was no birth control in those days. If Eve lived to be 950 years old, because women generally live longer than men, and she had a child every 3 years, we have to remember that Adam and Eve were created as mature people, she could have easily had about 300 children during her lifetime. This is just a guess. But Eve may have stopped conceiving a few years before her death, but she may have also had series of twins and triplets along the way, right? It would have been quite easy for humanity to multiply on the earth at that time. Now, according to my own calculations, humanity could have reached about 111,585,600 people by Adam and Eve's 500th creation day. Remember, they weren't born, they were created. So about their 500th year on earth, the population of humanity could have grown to this number of over 100 million. Again, this is not an exact number, but just understanding how the life cycle goes and understanding how couples come together, it could have naturally multiplied to this type of number. Now returning to the descendants of Cain, as we read in verse 17, and Cain had relations with his wife, and she became pregnant and gave birth to Hanok. And he built a city, and he called the name of the city like the name of his son, Hanok. So Cain's firstborn son is named Hanok, which means dedicated. And Cain named the city he built after his son, Hanok. We read the details of the line of Cain up to that final man whose name was Tuval Cain. We also read about his sister Naamah, and I'm not sure why she is mentioned, but Tuval Cain was the final man in that line as we read it. And we read, just to mention that his name, Tuval Cain, means either the product, the stream, or the line of Cain. So it's very fitting as well as we read about the descendants of Cain. It's also fascinating to read about those who were the first in different fields of life. We read about, number one, Yaval, who was the father of those who dwell in tents and keep livestock. Number two was Yuval. He was the father of those who mastered the harp and the pipe, different musical instruments. And number three, we have Tuval Cain, who was an instructor for all fabricating of bronze and iron, right? So all these different trades that, we even still have to today, right? We see how the beginnings of them happened in those days, in those years. Now, after the lineage of Cain, we read about these poetic words of Lamech, right, in verses 23 and 24. And Lamech said to his wives, Adah and Sila, listen to my voice, you wives of Lamech. Give ear to what I say, for I have killed a man for bruising me and a child for wounding me. If the vengeance of Cain is sevenfold, for Lamech it is 77-fold. So such interesting poetic words here by Lamech that are recorded for us for some reason. So why are we given this quote from Lamech? The quote from Lamech and his bragging about violence seems out of place. However, it also provides context to the lineage of Cain. Cain murdered Abel, and Lamech, a descendant of Cain, bragged about murdering others. Violence increased in the earth as the generations of Cain multiplied. By the time that we arrive at the days of Noah, violence characterized mankind, as we read in Genesis chapter 6. Quote, now the earth was corrupt in the sight of God, and the earth was filled with violence. And God looked on the earth, and behold, it was corrupt, for humanity had corrupted its way upon the earth. Then God said to Noah, the end of humanity has come before me, for the earth is filled with violence because of people. And behold, I'm about to destroy them with the earth. Such a powerful word from the Lord that happened generations later, right? But again, this is we read how violence filled the earth at that time. The earth was filled with violence. Again, that Hebrew word for violence there is Hamas. So it's interesting to see how that Hebrew word Hamas is used in the scriptures, as well as how the current day terrorist organization uses that name Hamas for itself as an acronym in Arabic, but it connects to the Hebrew word Hamas. Now, all was not well outside of the Garden of Eden in those beginning generations, and violence began to spread on the earth from the very first generation of Adam and Eve. From Cain, Adam and Eve's firstborn son, to Lamech, a descendant of Cain, violence characterized that lineage of Cain. Despite this dark picture of mankind and the violence, the murder, there was also hope in the midst of despair, as we read in the last two verses of Genesis chapter 4, verses 25 and 26. And Adam again had relations with his wife, and she gave birth to a son, and she called his name Seth, because God appointed for me another seed in the place of Abel when Cain killed him. And to Seth was also born a son, and he called his name Enosh. At that time there was a beginning of calling upon the name of the Lord. Seth's birth was a means of bringing healing to Eve's soul, as she states here, as we read in verse 25. She said, because God appointed for me another seed in place of Abel when Cain killed him. The name Seth in Hebrew is Shet, and it comes from the word sheet and means to set or appoint. And Eve acknowledged that it was God who appointed and enabled her to have another child in place of Abel. Now, in the final verse of Genesis 4, we read of Enosh, who is Seth's son and possibly his firstborn. It seems like it is. Now, Enosh is a unique name, and it's a significant word in Hebrew as we see it used in the scriptures. In addition to being the name of the son of Seth, Enosh is used for, in a general sense, for man or mankind or even humanity. And just to mention that the word Enosh is the same in both the singular and plural, right? So Enosh can be man or mankind, right? So mankind, it's that singular plural form in a sense, right? Humanity, right? It includes all the people. Now, the name or word Enosh appears 56 times in the Hebrew scriptures, and this does not include the Aramaic forms as we see in Daniel 7:13. For an example, right? Now, I want to give us several examples as we see it used in the scriptures in general, beginning with Psalm chapter 8, verse 4, where we read this: "What is man that you think of him, and a son of man that you are concerned about him?" So here we see two different forms of man. The first one in green is Enosh in the Hebrew, and the second one, the son of man, this phrase is Ben Adam. And I'll point out kind of some interesting connection to these words as well. But we see two different Hebrew words in the text that express this general form of man, right, or even the Son of Man. And just to point out as well that Psalm 8:4 is also a messianic prophecy, as we see in Hebrews 2:6. Moving on to our second example of Enosh in the scriptures. And we read this in Psalm 9:19-20. "Arise, Lord, do not let mankind prevail. Let the nations be judged before you. Put them in fear, Lord. Let the nations know that they are merely human. Selah." So here we see two different English words that are translated from the Hebrew, right? So we have mankind and human. But in the Hebrew, they're simply Enosh. And I think this is also a good example of how this word is used in a general way to speak of humanity or human or mankind. We see another example in Psalm 90, verse 3, where we read this: "You turn mortals back into dust and say, 'Return, you sons of mankind.'" So again, we have two different words here in the Hebrew and even in the English, right? So we have the word mortals, which is the original Hebrew Enosh. And then we have the phrase sons of mankind, and this is from the Hebrew Bnei Adam. And so, again, we see how these words are used in a synonymous way in many ways, Enosh and Adam or Ben Adam. And it's speaking of humanity or of mankind, right? And this makes sense too, because Adam in Hebrew, that he was the first man, right? So he represents man or mankind. And then you have Ben Adam, which is simply the son of man, right? So this is humanity as well, because we're all sons of Adam, sons and daughters of Adam, right? And then you have the word Enosh, which is also used of man or mankind, and it's used somewhat interchangeably, as we see from these several examples. And I think it's also pointing out the uniqueness of Enosh and the new line of humanity that was established. The birth of Seth brought comfort to Eve after the loss of Abel. The birth of Enosh, Seth's son, appears to speak of a new path of hope for humanity, right? So we see that play on words with Enosh and humanity. Now, one commentary found in the Jewish Study Bible interprets the birth of Seth, the father of Enosh, as establishing a new line as different or distinct from Cain. We read this, quote, "The culminating verse 26, right, the last verse in Genesis 4, speaks of what is, in the Jewish view, the most important of these, the proper worship of the true God. This comes not from the line of Cain, but from Adam and Eve's third son, Seth. The poem of Lamech in verses 23-24 continues the dark theme of violence associated with his ancestor Cain and attests to the increasing evil of the human race." So as this commentary explains, it is as if humanity was beginning anew from Seth as it distinguished itself from Cain. The line of Cain carries with it a pattern of violence that continues upon the earth, as you read about it in the life of Lamech. The line of Seth would start a new line, which began with Seth's son, Enosh, aka or otherwise known as humanity, right? He's giving us that picture of a new line of humanity. Now, after the birth of Enosh, we read the final sentence, which says, "At that time there was a beginning of calling upon the name of the Lord." So, what does this phrase mean, this sentence, this statement? A beginning of calling upon the name of the Lord. At that time, there was a beginning of calling upon the name of the Lord. So, we know that when Enosh was born, 235 years had passed since creation. And we know that from Genesis chapter 5, verses 1 to 6, if you add up those years. Now, exactly how the first family was living their spiritual lives during those days is not clear, outside of what we read in the text. From the birth of Enosh, there appears to be a spiritual awakening for those who began, quote, calling upon the name of the Lord. Now, I asked these questions in the beginning, and we've already answered the middle two questions about why did Cain kill his brother Abel, and in what ways did Cain sin against God. But I want to answer in a conclusive way, what did God expect from humanity in the beginning, meaning those first 4 chapters of Genesis as we've studied them up till now? And lastly, what does God expect from humanity today? So let's begin with that first question. What did God expect from humanity in the beginning? And I think we see these points on the screen clearly expected in the text, right? And spoken of or assumed in some way. Number one, God expected from humanity to be fruitful, to multiply, to fill the earth and rule over it. Number two, to work 6 days and rest 1 day, as God sanctified the 7th day. Number three, to work the soil in order to produce food. Number four, to bring first fruits to the Lord. Number five, to listen and obey the word of the Lord, or the voice of the Lord. And number 6, to call upon the name of the Lord. We see these things clearly in these first 4 chapters. The first fruits principle is the central issue in the account of Cain and Abel in Genesis 4. The first fruits principle is taught throughout the scriptures, all the way even into the New Testament. I just want to read these verses out of Proverbs chapter 3, verses 9 to 10, where we read, "Honor the Lord from your wealth and from the first of all your produce. Then your barns will be filled with plenty, and your vats will overflow with new wine." So that's what God expected from that first generation of people, right? What does God expect from humanity today? Actually, I think it's not too different. God's expectations are fairly unchanged from the beginning. God still expects humanity to be fruitful, to multiply, to fill the earth, and to rule over it, to work 6 days and rest 1, to work the land to produce food, to give first fruits back to the Lord, to listen and obey the word of the Lord. And number 6, to call upon his name. Now, his name today, in a personal manner, is Yeshua, the Messiah, his anointed one. We read a good summary statement of what God expects from humanity in all generations, which is found in the writings of the prophet Micah 6:8, a well-known verse. "He has told you, O man, what is good, and what does the Lord require of you, but to do justice, to love kindness, and to walk humbly with your God." In closing, I believe that Genesis 4:26 establishes an expectation from God that is both timeless and prophetic, to call upon the name of the Lord. In Joel 2:23, we read this timeless expectation as a prophecy, where it says this, quote, "And it will come about that everyone who calls on the name of the Lord will be saved." This verse in Joel is quoted twice in the New Testament. I'm going to read those examples and give a little bit of context. Now, Peter quoted from Joel 2:32 at the Feast of Weeks at Pentecost, after the 120 disciples of Yeshua in the upper room were filled with the Holy Spirit. Peter explained to his fellow Jews who were outside what was happening by quoting from the book of Joel, as we read this in Acts 2. But Peter, taking his stand with the other 11, raised his voice and declared to them, "Men of Judea and all you who live in Jerusalem, know this and pay attention to my words. For these people are not drunk, as you assume, since it is only the 3rd hour of the day. But this is what has been spoken through the prophet Joel." So that's Acts 2:14 to 16. Then Peter quoted from Joel 2:28 to 32, which I'm not going to read, but then he closes, or he ends that with Joel 2:32, which is recorded in Acts 2:21 as, "And it shall be that everyone who calls on the name of the Lord will be saved." Now we also see this same verse from Joel 2:32 in Romans chapter 10 when Paul explained the great salvation that began 2,000 years ago and continues until today. Romans 10:12-13. For there is no distinction between Jew and Greek, for the same Lord is Lord of all, abounding in riches for all who call on him. For everyone who calls on the name of the Lord will be saved. Such a beautiful promise. So what does God expect from humanity today? Ultimately, God desires and expects all of humanity to call upon his name and be saved. We see this from the very beginning in going back to Genesis 4, carried out through all of the scriptures and even into the New Testament until today. It is still God's desire, expectation for humanity to call upon him and to know his name, which is today Yeshua, to know his Messiah and to be saved. Such a beautiful connection of putting the scriptures together. So this is the conclusion to Genesis chapter 4, answering this question of what does God expect from humanity? Well, thank you so much for watching this video. Here's some of the resources I used in my preparation for this teaching. As always, I want to invite you to partner with Nether Glide. We are a nonprofit organization and we are totally dependent on donations from viewers like yourself. I also want to encourage you to subscribe to our weekly emails where we send out an email with our most recent teachings. So you can do so on our website at netherglide.com, or you can simply scan the QR code on your screen. And once you get to the website, you can either click the give or subscribe tabs as needed. Thank you so much. God bless you and see you again next time.